Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, we're technically speaking in the third minute of the afternoon here in New Zealand. Welcome to today's webinar on the Science of Food program funded by High Value Nutrition. I'm thrilled to have you all join us today for another session of our webinar series hosted by the Cubitt Institute at Massey University. My name is Ali Rashid Najad, and I'm a food scientist working here at the Cubitt Institute. Typically, our amazing stakeholder relationship manager, Melanie Rathol, would be hosting this webinar, but unfortunately, she's unwell after receiving her COVID booster shot yesterday. We wish her a speedy recovery. Today we have two incredible speakers with us who are experts in their respective fields. And Dr. Peter Brown, the principal at Spruson and Ferguson in Australia, will be discussing a view to the future in the space of global pattern landscape review of food of health. Following Dr. Brown, Michelle Cubitt, the founder and consultant at Smart Regulatory Solutions, will talk to us about the regulatory exporting toolkit for food and beverage products. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that we will have time for a Q&A session at the end of both presentations. So firstly, both speakers will give their presentations, and then we'll have our Q&A. You can send your questions via chat function here, or if you want to ask your questions verbally, you're welcome to do so by taking the mic at the end. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Peter to kick off his talk. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ali, and kia ora, everyone. Yes, so today we'll be looking at the patent landscape for food for health. And the data that I've been using for this analysis goes back to 2010. So essentially, a 12-year period of data they're using to kind of draw what the insights are telling us around what the companies are seeking IP protection for in this space. I'll also go into a bit of detail about how New Zealand is positioned in the global landscape to kind of see where we are doing well, where there's potential rooms for opportunity. I'll look at how the companies, specifically the top companies globally, are positioned in this landscape and what they're focused on. And I've got some good insights, for example, into Nestle. So we dive a bit deeper down into that space. Looking at the target health outcomes specifically. So where are the big opportunities, where are the companies focusing their attention on? And also linked to that, what are the food types that they're using to achieve those health outcomes? And I also break that down. I think it's quite important to break it down. China as one landscape, and then looking at what's actually happening outside of China, because as you'll see, China is very dominant in this patent landscape, and it's quite important to kind of differentiate what China's doing versus other countries. I'll also touch on a bit about how the broader landscape's looking outside of patents, what's happening in the VC landscape, and also what's happening in the research publications, because those are really good analytics to understand what potentially might be happening in the patent landscape and the commercialization landscape in the next, say, 10 years, for example. So that is just what I said. I won't go over that again. But those essentially is what I'll be talking about. And then obviously the takeaways for New Zealand businesses for future R&D is the kind of key outputs of what we can use this data for. So looking at the last 10 years as a whole, what you can see here is that it looks, at first glance, there's been this massive incline from 2010 to 2014, and then it's been reducing quite substantially after that, down to 2022. Just bear in mind that the data for 2022 and actually for 2021 is not fully complete. It's part of the patenting system where patents aren't actually published for 18 months after the original filing. But I think the key point in this slide is to realize that that dark blue, or that light blue, the bottom is actually, that's the Chinese contribution to the patent landscape. And you can see it's absolutely massive in comparison to a lot of the other countries. This is very reflective of what's happened in China across a whole bunch of different industries. There was government funding to file patent applications. And so there was this huge surge of patent filings about 10 years ago. If you actually look back prior to 2010, it would actually show that it's actually relatively stable. So I wouldn't take too much away from this. And what I'll show you on the next slide is actually a bit easier to understand. I think one thing here you should look at is that New Zealand doesn't actually feature in the top 20 country contributors. But I will get to that in a bit later, showing actually how New Zealand is doing. So this is the same data, but taking China out. And what you can see here is, other than some relatively big years for the USA and South Korea in 2011 to 2014, it's actually relatively stable. So South Korea is the second biggest filer in this space, and then USA being the next biggest filer as well. And just bearing in mind that the data that's used for this, it's specifically looking at patents in the food and beverage space that have a health outcome. Cool. So the next slide I just wanted to show you is how's this data being broken down in terms of who's filing them, what types of entities. So as you'd probably expect, the companies are probably the biggest filers, as you can see on the left-hand side. The four different colors shown for each entity type is just the status of the patent application. So inactive or essentially, it's dead, or it's been filed and then lapsed. You've got pending, which means that it's been recently filed. Active means that it's granted patent. And PCT means that it's at a relatively early stage. It's in its international phase. And something that's quite interesting, if you take this dive a bit deeper, something I found quite interesting anyway, is that when you look at the academics on the right-hand side, they've got a very high level of granted patents. So, I mean, you could argue here that the quality of the patents that are coming out of academia is very strong. It's deserving of granted patent rights. So kudos to the academics that are joining us today, that the patents coming out from the academic space is looking really good. So now we kind of dive down into how New Zealand's doing in this space. As you can see over on the right-hand side, China is a massive 64% of the entire patent landscape since 2010 in the space. New Zealand only represents about 0.1%. And you kind of think, oh, that's horrible, but it's actually not too bad. If you look further up that list, you can see we're actually doing better in terms of patent filings than the likes of Canada, Belgium, Singapore. These are countries that typically have quite a strong food and beverage sector. So arguably, we're actually doing all right. And I think it just reflects the fact that New Zealand, and I've mentioned this numerous times in the past, is that we are very far away from our target markets in terms of our exports for food and beverage. So it's really important that we use tools like patents to try and protect our innovation. So when we do go to export them, we can better protect that kind of premium price range. And we can prevent our competitors in closer jurisdictions from easily copying what we're doing. And it's also a really important point that instead of actually exporting the actual food, we can export our intellectual property instead. So it's really important that we look at IP and patents in particular. This graph here, actually, instead of looking at the total patent filings and how countries do comparatively, now we're looking at the value of the patents. And instead of China being number one, now you can see the US patents contribute far and wide the biggest amount in terms of overall value, which is based in US dollars And you can see these are significantly more than China. New Zealand here actually punches well above its weight again. Probably the biggest thing I want to just point out is that it's about half of what Australia is. You can see that's about $218 million worth of patent filings. And obviously New Zealand having a fifth of the population of Australia, but doing very well in terms of the patent filings, up to about half of what Australia is doing by value. So that's really good news. In terms of companies and which ones are doing the best, obviously I mentioned before, China's got this huge presence, but the Western multinationals, the likes of Nestle, Nutricia, Abbott, Mead Johnson, they are by far and wide the biggest filers individually. And what's really interesting is I'll show you in a few slides what they're actually focused on as well. So here you can see what I've tried to do is just break down the total patent data in this space and look at where the top 4 countries are focusing their attention on the health outcomes. And again, just to keep things as simple as possible, even though there's a lot on this slide, I've narrowed it down to the top 4 health outcomes that we saw in the landscape. So, and they are immunological disorders, nervous disorders, and when looking at that, it typically is around cognitive function, obviously preventing diseases in that cognitive space as well, like Alzheimer's and so forth. Digestive system or digestive disorders, and then metabolic disorders as well. And what you can see very clearly, you can see that blip that I was talking about before in the early 2010 to 2014. There's that big surge, obviously, in the total number of patents, but there's a real focus overall, I would say, in digestive system or digestive disorders and metabolic health. And something else that's quite interesting is the increase in nervous disorders and patents focused towards that space as well. Interestingly, China in particular seems to be very focused on digestive system, and which one was the other one? If you look at it and comparatively speaking, it's a lot of the digestive system is taken up by China, and also immunological disorders as well. They take up a big chunk, I guess, if you're looking at it relatively compared to the other top countries. So here, what we wanted to do is now break it down and just look at China specifically, and then go, what are the main disorders that China is focused on, and linking that back up to what are the food types they're using to achieve those outcomes. So just bear in mind that this actually uses like an AI tool through the PatSnap software that I use. So it's not 100% accurate in terms of the wording that you see down the bottom, but it gives a really good indication as to what's happening. So I guess the key take homes that I can see coming out of this is that there's a strong emphasis, if you look down the bottom, on using fermentation bacteria type products in that first column, and then also tea and milk preparation kind of are secondary, but obviously really important vehicles, so to speak, for these health outcomes. And then when you look at the actual health outcomes themselves, they are around digestive health, which seems to be the most focused area for China, but followed closely by metabolic health. So now we look out, if you kind of exclude China from the data and look at all the other country contributors, just bear in mind this does include South Korea and Japan and so forth, but it's everything except for China. It's an interesting contrast. Milk is now #1 in terms of the food vehicle. And then you've got foodstuff bacteria, and then you've got enzymes, proteins, and edible oils and fats as kind of the key food types being used in this health space. And contrary to China, the main focus here is around metabolic health, which is an interesting comparison to China. And when you look at metabolic health specifically, the food types that are being used are around milk and fats and oils. So now it's quite interesting to actually break it down by some of the bigger Western multinationals, and you can see here again that if you look at the top 3 multinationals in this space, they all have a preferential focus towards metabolic health as well. Interestingly, like I alluded to before, nervous disorders is not too far behind digestive health, for example. So this could really be the next kind of focus area, I think, for health through food. And I couldn't help myself last night. I got a bit carried away, kind of digging a bit deeper into this data. And so I decided to have a look at Nestle specifically on what they're doing over time, because I think it's quite interesting to see how the companies actually progress over the years and where they're focusing their attention. And what you can see here is how Nestle has broken down its patents over the last 10 years or so. And what I found quite interesting, as I was mentioning in the previous slide, is that there is an increased focus more recently on nervous disorders or cognitive function. And then if you take it a step further, which I always like to do, I took that data, reanalyzed it in PatSnap, and identified that in terms of all the patents that Nestle is working on recently in that kind of nervous disorder space, you come up with these kind of keywords in a word cloud. And what is probably the key takeaway is that it seems to be that most of the patents in the space that Nestle is working on is focused towards infant nutrition around the cognitive space. So I think that's really kind of interesting insights for companies to think about, especially if they're looking at partnering with the likes of Nestle's or other big multinationals. And we also don't have the marketing potential that the research market research analysis that Nestle have, so we can kind of piggyback off of their analysis to kind of understand where the opportunities might lie. Interestingly, I just had a quick look at a university in China. This university, I don't know too much about it, but just having a quick Google search on them seems that they're very focused on food innovation. And what I found quite interesting here is, contrary to the trends of China with the lesser filings over the last 3 or 4 years, this university has actually picked up its filings. And again, there's been a lot of emphasis on metabolic health and nervous disorders as again. So I'm just conscious of time. It's 20 past, but just wanted to focus on a couple of these other analytics before I hand over to Michelle. So what you can see here is the VC investment in food for health, and over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, there's been an increase in venture capital investment, and most of that investment, as you can see on that map down the bottom right, is happening in the US, with a lesser amount happening elsewhere. So I think it's really important that companies that are looking at the space, looking to raise capital, they really have their their tentacles out, thinking about how they can raise capital through the US. And then finally, just looking at in terms of research publications in this space as well, you can see that the general trend is upwards, which is great, and supports that, as well as all the capital that's going into this, all the VC, that there's really a lot of interest in this space still. And I would expect that over the next 5 or so years, that the patent trends will at least maintain or potentially even increase based off this supplementary information here. So just trying to tie that all up together into a concise summary. Definitely China has been the dominant contributor, but US patents are the most valuable. There's really strong IP from research institutions with really high grant rates, so they play an important part in this landscape. New Zealand contributes a small fraction overall, but as I was saying, we're a small country. We punch above our weight overall, especially given the amount of funding that we've got. China has quite a different lean towards different types of food vehicles and health outcomes to the West. So it's really important to understand that when you're thinking about where your target is and how you're going to develop your products. Understanding of multinationals is really important and can really affect how you're going to develop your overall R&D strategy. And then the investment and research publications show really strong increases, which is supportive that there's going to be a lot of future innovation in this space. So I will pass over to Michelle, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that insightful presentation. Michelle, you're in the driver's seat now.
There we go. Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Peter. So the part that I'm talking a bit more about today is looking at what it takes when you're starting to look at export opportunities for food and beverage products. So the idea behind this little set is to try and build a little bit of a toolkit, I guess, around aspects to look at if you're going to start assessing an export opportunity. And this is regardless of whether you've potentially already got export opportunities or it's something that you're looking for in the future. And it's broken down into 4 key areas. So there's the market itself in terms of how all of their regulations are structured, what types of classifications they may have. Is it still considered a food or is it something else? There's a whole lot of stuff specifically in the product space, and this covers a really wide spectrum from the ingredients that are used, also the final formulation and the format of the product, as well as things like stability testing, quality parameters, anything to do with, say, potential residues and contaminants in that space. In terms of market entry, that is very much focused on any notification or registration type requirements. Sometimes this can be a pre-market approval, other times it's just a bit more of a notification or a registration of the specific importer. And something that I won't touch too much on today, but is definitely very important in this space, of course, is all of your IP and your trademark considerations, especially if you're looking to build a specific brand. You kind of need to know what permissions or restrictions there are in this space and what your ability to operate is going to be like based on all of those sorts of considerations. If we jump into just a few key questions, I guess, and this is probably one of the biggest takeaways from this presentation, is if you remember nothing else from all of this, remember that you just need to keep asking questions when it comes to an export opportunity. And a few of the really key considerations are things like, are all the ingredients that you're using permitted? Are there specific restrictions in place with those? What can you do around telling your story and making claims? Can you still tell the same story? Can you still make the same claims that you could potentially do here in New Zealand? Covering off all of those testing requirements is really important, especially if there are upfront ones that you need to provide in terms of test data as part of a registration. Labeling, of course, is always very key, and we'll go into a little bit around how this can shift and differ between different markets. And also, does it need to be registered? So what does that time frame look like? What do those costs look like? What are the documentation requirements? And all of this sort of comes together to determine, is a market particularly straightforward to enter into based on a food product from New Zealand, or is it something that could potentially pose a few more challenges? So if we look at our different tools, this is breaking it down into the key components that I will go through now, and it's a case of formulation, labeling. The manufacturer and the importer are quite important, especially if you need particular manufacturer certifications to be able to enter a market. The choice of importer or distributor can be really critical because often they may be the one that has to do the actual in-market notification or registration. So you are looking for someone who's very competent in those aspects, but also if this requires a lot of information sharing, then you need to obviously have quite strong agreements in place because you will be handling probably quite a bit of sensitive information through to them around your formulation and potentially your manufacturing process as well. looking at all the different testing requirements, and then just the documentation requirements if there are some for market entry. So looking at product formulation, these are some of the more common ones that can create some challenges for food products. Often there can be additives that you potentially are using that may have different permissions or restrictions in another country. So looking at your entire formulation and all of the ingredients and components that are used are really important. And then that leverages into things such as, is something potentially a novel food? So if it's something new to an international market, are there further registration requirements for that specific ingredient before you can use it, if you're using something that's reasonably new or innovative? Because of all of our animal products regulations, ingredients of animal origin will come with potentially additional certification requirements, different market access requirements. So looking at making sure any and all of those are covered off with all of the MPI expectations. If you're looking at incorporating New Zealand Indigenous species, this is one to really pay attention to in terms of your ability to go into new markets. Obviously, these are ingredients that aren't commonly consumed elsewhere in the world, so this may also lead back into the novel foods conversation, potentially, depending on how they're used and what kind of food products they're used in. Sometimes if they're a bit more of a flavouring, it's a little bit easier in terms of market entry. Other times, if they're looking at a bit more of a active function to them in terms of a health benefit, then there can be a few more pieces of investigation required before you may be able to enter the market of interest. So to give this a little bit of a flavour in terms of how these things can change. So something that's a little bit different in Japan to New Zealand is that in Japan, on your product label, you're required to label all of your food additives and your processing aids if you have any. So if you were making, say, a lozenge and it had a release aid in it to help you get that lozenge out of the mold. Here in New Zealand, you probably wouldn't have to divulge that release agent if it was falling under the classification of a processing aid, whereas if you were sending the same product to Japan, you do need to include that specific agent on your label as well. As I was talking about for animal products, making sure that both import permits or any MPI export certification that's required, you understand all of the bits and pieces that go into getting those permits or those certificates before you're really looking at actually formally exporting your product offshore. Often in Europe, a number of plant species from New Zealand can be considered novel foods, and there can be quite a process in terms of demonstrating that those components are actually safe for consumption in markets like the EU, where there's quite strict regulations in this space. And then, as I was saying, with the food additives and things, it might be that the food additive that you're using is still permitted, but there may be a different maximum limit that is put in place, or in some cases where you've got different food standards. Probably this is a lot more in the dairy space rather than in a few other sort of more processed food products like snack bars, but there can be restrictions on exactly the type of additives that you are permitted to include in those. So these are all things to start really digging into quite early in terms of a product formulation when you're looking at exporting. And then next on the list, of course, is all of the testing that goes along with your product as well. So quite often there will be a requirement of some sort to verify your technical specification or a certificate of analysis for your product. And then sitting in behind those specifications or that C of A It can be how you've determined your shelf life. So you might not necessarily be required to actually divulge shelf life data, but there does need to be some kind of a justification for why you have placed a particular shelf life on a product. And this can be both from a safety point of view and making sure that, you know, there's no unintentional microbial growth over the time of the shelf life, but also if you are potentially making label claims about the quantity of a particular ingredient, you want to be able to verify that that quantity stays at the amount that's been claimed on the label over the specified shelf life. It can vary quite a lot between markets, but there are differing requirements around things such as heavy metals and residues. So this can divulge into things such as aflatoxins, melamine, varying levels of micro requirements as well. Sometimes it's just enough for you to determine these are the tests that ensure my product is safe. Other markets will be far more prescriptive, say, about the type of micro tests and the limits that are applied with those tests as well. So it's important to understand what those limits look like and your feasibility of being able to actually achieve those limits ongoing. And then on top of that, again, as I was saying, with the shelf life, also your ability to verify your label claims, especially if you're claiming the quantity of an ingredient. So understanding that, generally speaking, the level of tolerance is 90% or greater for any label claim, and looking at making sure that that is achievable. If someone in market was to pull that product off the shelf and test it, it's expected that it would be able to meet the stated amount that you've put on a label. Another really important piece to look at quite early on potentially can be around your claims or even your overall proposition. Your ability to tell a story can be quite impacted depending on what is permitted for different claims and what the process is for being able to register and make claims in different countries. Certainly here in New Zealand, it's a fairly black and white process in terms of how claims can be made for food products, but there may be additional requirements when you start looking at overseas markets, and often they can require their own evidence dossiers or their own types of submissions. So it's not just an automatic situation of if you can make a particular claim in New Zealand, then you would be able to make that claim elsewhere in the world. And a really interesting one that is really evolving in this space as well is free from claims. So there are some free from claims that are quite strongly regulated, especially more in the sort of macronutrient space. So if you're saying it's like no sugar added or it's gluten-free, those sorts of claims, quite often there will be some very specific rules in place around how you can make those claims. But then other claims such as say GMO free or it's sort of more looking in the positive angle of if you're going to claim that, say, something is vegan or vegetarian friendly, then looking at, is it feasible to make some of those claims and what type of data is required to substantiate that. Different markets can have different expectations, especially in the GMO space, around whether that claim is even feasible and exactly how you can justify. And I'll run a little bit more into what's happening in the sustainability space as well. So if you're looking at your options in the claim space, one of the very key things to consider up front is whether it runs on a system of authorised claims. So whether there is an approved list of claims and then what you can do to utilise claims within that authorised list, or what the feasibility is like to add new claims to that list. So the notification of health claims here in New Zealand is a fairly straightforward process. It's quite clear in terms of expectations around evidence requirements. Now, if you were to take that same system into the EU, it is reasonably clear in terms of what the process is for getting a new claim, but at the same time, the minimum evidence requirements typically are a lot higher than what is accepted in this space in New Zealand. So really mapping out what that process looks like can then really inform what your evidence dossier is. And so whether it's suitable enough that you have a really good, well-designed clinical trial, or if the expectation is that actually you need a far wider systematic review of all of the evidence available and how that all stacks up compared to the type of claim that you're making. And another really key piece to all of this as well is how that claim is worded. Some markets will have a reasonable level of flexibility, especially if they've got authorised claims. There may be a level of flexibility around the wording that you actually use on your label versus the authorised wording. And in other markets, it's very strict, and it's basically you use the wording as it is approved, and there's not much flexibility elsewise. So, for example, you can potentially use the word immunity here in New Zealand to go alongside a immune health claim, but in countries like the UK or the Philippines, the word immunity is not accepted, and it must be something that is far closer to the approved wording, which is probably more along the lines of immune support. And a key trend that's really starting to grow is these high fat, sugar, and salt products. So if you're formulating in this space, just be aware that there is internationally more regulation coming in place around those sorts of products. So if you're at the stage of formulating something, really thinking about being mindful of those specific things to make sure that either you avoid them completely or you know what the impact is in terms of your ability to label and advertise for those types of products. Sustainability is really growing these days as well, so it's quite important to understand if there is movement around what is now being termed greenwashing, especially if you're looking at making claims about the practices of your business or something to do with your packaging. So being aware that things such as, you know, your compostable, your recyclability, if you're using a plant-based plastic versus your traditional plastic sources, or any comments around carbon footprint and things, what are the expectations in terms of evidence to substantiate all of these claims? Essentially, the bottom line in terms of the trend is that more and more they're expecting a level of evidence to be able to substantiate each of these, but what the evidence looks like and how much of it you need to have can vary. So do dig into that space if you're looking at really making sustainability a core part of your proposition. Next, if we're looking at labelling, it really has a huge impact in terms of export. These are just some of the very top line things that can vary quite significantly between markets, and this can really affect your ability to combine different markets. So looking at all of this in terms of your ability to rationalise labelling, it can get quite tricky. So very, very quickly, things to really consider is where is this information going and what does the mandatory information need to look like? Do pay particular consideration to languages. There can potentially be the ability to use over-labelling, but you need to see how that looks in terms of the type of packaging that you're using. And then again, coming back to, you know, if you're going to start making sustainability claims around packaging, how does things like over-labelling then affect that type of claim? To give a flavour of this in terms of probably one of the things that most commonly varies between markets, and that is the nutrition information, and it really comes down to the format of that nutrition information box and also the types of nutrients that you have inside that. So to give a little bit of a flavour, These are just standard nutrition declarations for 6 different markets. So looking at it all, you've got very different options, even in what types of nutrients are declared and how they are declared. So for some markets, it's per 100 grams. For some markets, it has to be per serving. New Zealand, it's per serving and per 100 grams. Even how you declare energy can be quite different. And then looking across them as well, it varies quite a bit in terms of the mandatory nutrients that you need to declare on that list as well. So, you know, looking at North America, there's quite a few more nutrients that you're going to need to have when you do nutrition testing versus if you're looking more into the UK or the EU, Japan or China. So it really, this is where it really pays to start looking at things early if you're going to start doing things like investing in nutrition testing, and you are looking potentially at North America as an export opportunity. Any nutrition testing you've done for the New Zealand market, obviously there needs to be a bit more tacked onto that if you're going to start looking at a North American opportunity. Market entry, this changes quite frequently. So this is just a very top level idea of the things to look at, but things to keep in mind are the types of certification that the manufacturer and even potentially the warehouse, if it's been warehoused somewhere differently, needs to have, and what that needs to look like. It's really important to look at the overseas market access requirements. So these are all hosted on the MPI website, and these can give quite a good understanding of whether there are export certification requirements and potentially what types of documents are needed as part of that. Importer licensing can be quite critical. So the importer that you're using does need to be specifically licensed to be able to say, register and import particular food products, and also being able to get an understanding of, when going through that registration process, finding out sooner rather than later all of the different documentation requirements that are needed for that particular notification or registration. It could be that information also needs to be translated, so that time and cost needs to be built in as part of developing your market entry. And to put it all together, you kind of start to create a little bit of a checklist for yourself. And it's not necessarily always feasible to check everything all at the beginning when you're just assessing an opportunity, but you can kind of start with a high level assessment. So this is more like a toe dip, I guess, to understand, is a market potentially a good one for you to go into, or is it potentially going to be a little bit more challenging just based on what your current proposition is or what your current product is, or if there's, say, potentially some trademark issues with operating in that market. Those are things that just get done quickly and out of the way before you start looking further into something that's a bit more in-depth, and then looking into the technical detail around, okay, if this is really going to be an opportunity, how do I tick all of these aspects off before jumping into signing on the dotted line with any export arrangement. Just to summarize all of this, overall, if there's anything that you want to take away from it, yes, ask lots of questions. There will always be things that you need to know that you're just not aware of. So at each step, look at what you need to be questioning around. Are there requirements for ingredients? Are there potential things that you need to know around the time frame and the costs for, say, a market registration? Potential restrictions, those sorts of things. But it's really key to start your research early on, so you can even just to identify if there are particular markets that you need to take off your radar because they fall into the high complexity basket, and that potentially could be too much for where your current situation is. The complexity is really key to understand, because you need to find out your ability to operate compared to New Zealand. You know, is it vastly different to what we have here, or is it quite reasonably well aligned so that the jump's quite small? And then if you're looking at developing your strategy in this space, definitely, as you can see, regulations weave in and out and all around the different parts of an export strategy. So just looking at each stage around what some of those requirements can be and what your potential considerations are will really help your future market access in this space. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. There was certainly a lot of useful information there. It's time to open the floor to questions. I cannot see any question being posted in the chat box there, but we do welcome any questions you may have for our speakers, either Peter or Michelle, about their presentation or related topics. If there is no question there, that means it could be a lot of engagement via microphone. So feel free to open your mic and ask your questions. All right, I may start one comment / question for you, Peter. It was great to hear that the quality of the patents coming from the academic organizations high. Good news. And I think this is a great finding and strong message to our industry partners that they can work with academics to present a fully baked cake. And of course, it's fair to say that, you know, there can be concerns when they want to approach academics to either collaborate or help them in this space. And do you have any advice on how they can go with this approach?
Yeah, great question. I think a couple points there. I mean, yes, it's great that those patents are going through to grant. It doesn't necessarily translate, obviously, to commercialized innovation. So I think just probably a quick call out that, you know, I think the earlier the better to kind of start that collaboration, because then you can kind of tailor the not only the R&D, but the patent filing to really hone in on the commercial opportunity and make sure that the industry partner is happy with the level of protection that's being sought. That's probably the key message, I would say, that, yeah, it's really good news overall that there's some really great quality patents coming through, but getting that industry insight and that collaboration on board early is always better from my perspective. Yeah, keen to hear any comments you've got as well from an academic perspective.
Yeah, none so far. There was also another interesting side, the recent focus from Nestle on the nervous disorder space. That's also very interesting. And I wonder if you have any idea on what the driver is behind this in recent years.
No, I mean, I know that Nestle has obviously been very interested in infant nutrition for a long time, and I know there's a lot of companies that are very interested in the space overall, but I suspect it's just Nestle that's just focusing on an area that they are familiar with and have got experience with and have those brands already out there that they can build on. But you know, you can see the mega trend is coming through. There's a lot of new products entering the market, even without patent protection, that are focused on this space. So I think that Nestle, in a sense, is perhaps jumping on that global mega trend and just leveraging their brands and their space in that market already.
All right, thank you. There is one question from Jonathan. Is the high level of milk-based patents related to the fact that milk/dairy is the carrier of milk, the key ingredient, or is the milk key ingredient? What's the reason?
Oh, right. Yeah, I didn't get down to that level of detail in the analysis, but it'd be quite interesting to see, because obviously, yeah, milk can be the carrier, or milk could be the functional thing. So I suspect it's a mix of both. But it'd be an interesting analysis to do as to whether or not it's just the carrier or if it's the innovation itself. But yeah, I know there's tons of dairy innovation going on, the likes of Fonterra and other companies in New Zealand, and obviously in a lot of multinationals around the world, and even in China as well, where they're actually dairy itself is the innovation, and they're just manipulating it, doing fermentation technologies, synthetic biology, replicating the actual milk proteins, and using those for gut health and so forth. So there's a lot happening actually for dairy. And then obviously, like Michelle was talking about, having dairy as the nutritional base allows you to potentially make a number of health claims centered around that, but also use it as a vehicle for, fortification with other micronutrients like FairyPro, for example.
Thank you, Vida. Michelle, talking about the shelf life of the product in the reg space that you covered, how valid are the data from the accelerated shelf life experiments?
Good question. They're very acceptable in terms of an initial judgment of shelf life, especially if you're looking at, first entering a market. But the longer term sort of expectation, I guess, is that at some point you are going to follow that up with a real-time study. And one probably key point to bear in mind with those real-time studies is knowing the climate conditions of the market that you're going into. So if you're looking at something that is far more tropical or far more hot, your real-time studies do need to look at more of that hotter end of the spectrum, around sort of 30 degrees, rather than say a standard 25 degrees that we might do for something here.
All right, any more questions from audience, please? I can see the number is dropping and people rushing probably to catch up lunch. But for the remaining people, please don't be shy and feel free to participate in the remaining minutes. All right, I cannot see any more questions coming through. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for another insightful session of our Science of Food program webinar series. I hope you found the presentations by our experts, Peter and Michelle, informative and engaging. I did so, and I enjoyed listening to both. So I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our speakers for taking the time to share their expertise and knowledge with us today. Their insights and great contribution to our programs actually highly appreciated. And once again, I would like to thank all of you for participating in today's session. We look forward to seeing you at our future webinars. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you later.
See ya.